Hi, everyone. I'm here with Jordan Alcon. We're doing an interview today about his experience homeschooling. So here he is.
Hey.
For the first question, I just want you to tell us a little bit about what your experience was like, and how did your parents come about even starting homeschool for you?
Well, I was always homeschooled, so we were never put in a school and then taken out. I think it probably primarily came from my mom. She grew up in a Catholic school and she hated that. And she remembers how traumatizing that was. And then at the time, they were pretty religious. So I think the combination of not wanting to subject us to school how she was, and then not wanting to be taught. I think there's a lot of things like what the government tries to indoctrinate people with in school. So they were trying to avoid that. And then being religious, there was, the religious reasons and the way schools don't follow that. So probably all that combined is why they made the decision to not put us in school.
That makes sense. What type of methodology did she use for the homeschooling?
Unfortunately, they went with the curriculum. So they would find whatever the popular curriculum route was at the time. I know there was some like homeschool book fairs, and there was a few other homeschool groups. So people would talk about, what they were using and what's available. And they went the curriculum route, which looking back, I don't feel like I learned near as much as I could just following that. It would still kind of follow the typical school model where you do a lesson plan and you have to do a test at the end of it. But maybe from our perspective, or at least for me, it was a little bit worse because we would do the test and any questions we got wrong, we would have to go back and do them until they were all right.
Oh, okay.
So we were never graded from the aspect of, this is how you did, then move on. It was, you have to get everything right.
Mm-hmm.
Some days that took a while and that was a bit frustrating. Maybe that's why I don't like taking tests now, but
Because of those experiences?
yeah, it's kind of a negative experience. I think learning should be positive and it should be what the child wants to learn, and they'll like to do it and they'll want to keep doing it. Whereas if you make it negative, then they're going to do it enough to get by. And then when they're on their own, are they going to want to do it? Probably not as much.
Yeah, that's what we found when we first started. And then as I got to know them more, it was easy to implement more, interest-led, passion-led elements.
Oh, yeah.
Were there a lot of you? Like, how many brothers and sisters do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's all based on perspective, but there was 6 of us total. Mm-hmm. So people would say that's a lot. There was 3 boys and 3 girls. I'm the second oldest. So a lot of us being homeschooled was also taking care of the younger siblings. That was probably a pretty valuable aspect of it. It sure did make it different for me compared to a lot of people I know when I had kids, because I'd basically already raised 2 kids whenever I was a kid. I'd take care of my brothers and sisters sometimes all day when my mom would have a newborn. So I'd be taking care of a 3-year-old. And, she would always be around, but largely tied up with the new baby. So I'd, help make food and take care of them and play with them. So, I mean, that was really valuable. I think anything that you can apply directly to life whenever you're doing school is going to be more valuable than passing a test in a book.
Would you say it's created a really close relationship with your family?
Yes and no. I think it was partially us being forced to mainly only associate with each other, and we didn't have a whole lot of friends growing up. So that might have created some resentment in ways where maybe we're not as close as if it was more of a voluntary relationship. But we know each other really well.
Yeah. So what would you say is your most enjoyable experience out of the whole?
Probably like going on field trips with, other homeschool groups, or as far as the actual school aspect, just reading. I figured out early on, if I found something I wanted to read, then that could always be my excuse to not do other things. So whenever it'd be time to like do a math lesson or take a math test, I'd be like, Mom, I'm reading. So I'd sit there and read for like 6 hours a day. And I mean, I guess that enabled me to be a really good reader, but um, I don't know. I liked it. I still like to read. I can read really fast, and I can, put down a full book in a couple days, and other stuff. I didn't really find it that useful.
So how were you introduced to the trivium method?
I found it on a YouTube video, a guy that talks about owning silver. He talked about the trivium method and different aspects of control and how that was taken away. And then I found Peace Revolution about 8 months ago and started listening to that. And of course, it's talked about a lot in that.
So you didn't know any of that other tragedy and hope stuff prior to 8 months ago?
That's right.
Really?
Yeah.
So you've
Yeah.
known this stuff for a long time.
I have found bits and pieces in other sources, and I think what personally attracted me to Tragedy and Hope, it was all compiled together, and it just kind of reconfirmed what I already thought was true. So I just used it to, reinforce the confirmation bias, which always feels good.
Mm-hmm. So you never took any formal homeschooling curriculum on the fallacies or argument or dialectics or things like that?
Now, I think if anything, the most valuable aspect of homeschooling was the damage it didn't do. I think in a lot of aspects, people that have received no education would probably be better than a typical school education, since there's so much that has to be deprogrammed. So it made it pretty easy for me to find other bits of information and look at it critically without having that lens that's already been placed in front of people when they go through the education system.
Did you find any struggles in trying to get a job or what you were going to do after when you were a teenager with your experience of homeschooling?
The education aspect with getting a job was never brought up. No one even acted like they read that aspect of an application. On a job application, I would just put homeschool, like that's the entire education, and no one even looked at it. And then with jobs, it's like any job that is difficult to get at first because you don't have any practical experience. But my family knew a lot of people, and I had some people vouch for me, and I got a job. And then once I started working places, probably the biggest struggle was not understanding the programming other people went through and why they wouldn't question things, and there'd be processes in place that were inefficient, and then I would suggest ways to change it and make it better, and no one wanted to do that. And it took me a long time to realize those reasons.
When you got into the high school age group, did you have to do really a lot of formal language work, writing work, essays, and persuasive arguments?
I don't really ever remember doing anything like that. Might have done a couple essays. We would do a lot of dictation whenever we were younger. So my mom would read, and then we'd have to write it all out. And all the papers were written out in cursive. I don't think they really teach that as much anymore. Yeah, I think it's valuable to at least know how to read it. And I think writing it makes sense as well. But I don't really remember doing many essays. I know we wrote some papers. As far as like high school type education went, I probably stopped at around 15. I think I had started algebra 2. I don't remember what age that was, but I think that's around the 15-year-old range. And luckily I got out of finishing it because I hated doing it, and I didn't see a practical use for it. I think that was one of my biggest struggles with school, is when we were told to do something without being explained why and how we would use it, actually make it so we wanted to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you need to have a skill to progress towards your goals, you will want that skill, even if it's difficult to acquire it. But when we're told to learn something like a lot of the history stuff, which is probably mostly wrong, and then once you learn dates, how is that going to benefit me ever towards my goals?
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I hear my son say that all the time. This is our conversation with, well, Mom, I get this, but how am I ever going to use this? Interesting.
What's your answer to that?
Well, it's, I guess what would I when he says, where am I going to use this? Then I look at, well, it's just the reading aspects of it. It's just understanding where to put this information. You don't have to memorize dates. We don't memorize any of that history
Right.
stuff. I just, at this point, I just read. We do a lot of read alouds. A lot. He reads himself, and I read out to them all, and it's just story form. But I don't get them to memorize it. But yeah,
Right.
when he says, I don't see how this applies, when he's doing his multiplication times tables, I say, well, it'll just make your life easier by knowing it off by heart, because it's just one of those skills that having the multiplication tables, or it's going to make division easier when you're in a store or when you're doing something. Yeah, you always have a calculator, but you still, just being able to understand the basics, like 1 to 12, it's good to just have that memory.
Is there anything he'll do that requires that? Like whenever I'm building stuff and I'm using a measuring tape, that requires math, and to be able to do the math well, it makes what you want, like what you want to build, the goal, easier. So I found the issue for me early on was all this stuff is a concept, and to apply the concept in reality is something I need to see to want to do it.
So you're saying using your 5 senses is how you, right? When you're
when you're actually learning something, taking what you learn and placing it in reality. So you need math because if you want to build something, or if you want to buy something, or if you want to determine a number of something in reality, you need this concept to figure it out.
Yeah.
But I would be told, you'll need to know these things, kind of like what you're saying, because it'll make your life easier, which is true. But unless I could actually apply that to reality and what that was in my life, it still didn't really matter to me.
Okay, that makes sense.
So all these things which are true, which will make someone's life easier, I think it would be helpful to actually go through those things and what they are and practice it in a practical application, and then it makes you want to learn it.
Real life.
Yeah. Like with history, something I've considered is a lot of the history you read is probably not that accurate. The dates don't really matter that much, but if we're talking about history of like the medical associations, if you had the American Medical Association, which I believe was started by Rockefeller, and he was a snake oil salesman, you kind of go through the whole history of that system and see where it started from, because it's still around today and it affects our life. And by knowing why it was created and the purpose and how it was created, you'll be able to make better decisions now with your life and what you take as accurate information, and how much due diligence you need to do. And that can apply to the history of the education system, the medical associations, all this stuff. So from that historical perspective, it's very valuable. But learning when somebody supposedly sailed a boat and landed on a piece of land, and their personal life story, is that important? Probably not, unless you can figure out how that applies to someone today.
Mm-hmm. Like with the Rockefellers, they're influencing our Canadian government right now to put a stop to the pipeline. So, because they don't want the Alberta to be able to use that resource, so that we're using the states so instead.
Right.
So yeah, this is a real life application. Knowing that background, now we can kind of put more of an understanding and context today, which is going to help me in if I were to opt in on voting.
Right.
That's another conversation. Interesting. So what advice? Yeah, I guess my next question would be, how did you take all of this accountability for your learning? That makes sense. Your personal accountability. It just seems that you really know how to articulate well. You know how to put your thoughts into order. You can write really well. In my experience with interacting with you. So how did you gain these skill sets by being homeschooled?
Probably it was actually later. Like, unfortunately, when I was a kid, I didn't see the practical application. I don't think it was explained as well as it could have been, because my parents came from the school system. So they weren't necessarily homeschooling us to give us a different type of education. They were trying to protect us from the school system. And they assumed that that type of education was still what was necessary without thinking outside the box. So from like the homeschool aspect, I think it didn't program me in many ways that people go through the education system are programmed. And that allowed me, whenever I was older, like older teenager or young 20s, to learn whenever I figured out it was actually valuable to learn. And I guess it was basically to excel my skills so I could reach my goals. Like that's what it's all about, right? You want to accomplish something, so you're going to do what it takes to be able to accomplish that. And I think if you don't go through the programming of the school system, it's a whole lot easier to learn those things. You're not put into that type of thinking already.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I find that I think I'm making it a lot more complicating than I have to, or I'm worrying a lot about the end result instead of just the day to day right now.
Yeah, because you came from the education system, right? Like
Right.
that was your existence, and you assume that that's what has to happen to be competent in the world. Whereas like today, my 5-year-old was asking me about the body. I opened up my mouth and she saw the uvula. She's like, "What's that?" I'm like, well, let's look it up. We'll read about it. She's like, "Oh, that's cool." She's like, "What's in your knee?" And I was like, "Oh, well, let's look up some anatomy of the knee." And she's like, "I want to learn about the whole body. What's over here?" And she has an anatomy book. It's like a college book. And she gets it out and we start going through it. She's like, "Oh, what's this?" I'm like, "Well, that's your heart." She's like, "Read to me about that." So she's naturally curious and she wants to learn. And that was spontaneous. And when she wanted to do it, it wasn't, "Hey, let's sit down at the table and learn anatomy." Because I don't think she would have gone for it at all.
No, right. I've experienced that as well.
Yeah.
I just want to sit down and do something. It has to be, it's kind of like you can see in the background, like I have all of these resources, and when the information's kind of stewed. So if a question comes up, then at least we have somewhat resources that trying to find that are true, or if they aren't true, we kind of mark it up that it's not true, or we look through the original resources, or
Right.
yeah. But it's having that. I feel like as a homeschool parent, I'm really just here to help whatever that curiosity is at the time. So it's kind of like when you say, what's that set time that you do in a day? It's hard to define that because a lot of times it's just I'll have a plan, but then that plan changes this day because there's all these other curiosity questions that we were busy kind of coming up with or finding out, or
Right.
because like you said, it was like one question and then it led to like all these other questions.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about anatomy for almost an hour.
Yeah.
They just want to learn about everything. And I think you can look at anything in your existence and just start discovering it. We drove by a field a while back and there was cotton growing in it. It's like, "Oh, what's that white stuff?" Like, "Well, that's cotton. It makes your clothes." Like, "Really?" I'm like, "Yeah, you want to learn how that works?" So then we started looking up videos of the entire process from harvesting it to, putting on the loom and making the clothes. And I think if you look at anything in a child's life that they're interested in, it can be made a learning opportunity to start talking about how everything works.
Yeah. It's exciting. So would that be your advice to give to other people that are starting out this journey? That, like for myself, that like I have gone through that education system, even though I feel like I'm far from knowing anything.
Right. Yeah, I would find what interests them and then go through the process of, how everything works and why you need to learn certain things. Like when I was talking to my daughter about math, we're talking about body, and I'm like, "Well, how many toes do you have?" I'm like, "Well, 5." I'm like, "What about the other foot?" 5. And they're like, "Okay, then what's that added together?" So you can turn anything practical that they're interested in into other subjects and they'll want to learn about it. And the other thing I was thinking is most learning through the education system is in a linear fashion. But when we're talking about anatomy, we're talking about everything. It wasn't just anatomy, but it was math and, all these other subjects.
Yeah. I think intrinsically, you have gone through everything that really, I find that the best resources. It's really similar to Well-Trained Mind,
Mm-hmm.
which is based on the Trivium method. And she says throughout the book the exact same thing. It's just finding these little opportunities where learning can happen. And you be interested, like it's intrinsic, it's immersion. All these other things are part of it as a whole,
Right.
rather than just these set subjects that they think that that's what a child needs. You know, you need to sit down and do math. It's more like math included in all the aspects of what it's a part of everything that we do in a day or in a life, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I found in situations where someone can't actually explain how it's useful, it may not be. So it might just be a waste of time, at least at that moment, to even learn it. With our daughter, we haven't spent a whole lot of time on the alphabet. Whenever she's interested, we'll talk about it, but we try to sit her down and look it over. She's not going to go for it. And I've been surprised about how much she's learned in such a small amount of time. I think it's because she wants to learn at that moment, so she just takes it in. Whereas if you're going to sit someone down and spend a couple hours, maybe a few minutes of that's actually productive and the rest is just wasted time.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm finding that this is very valuable. Thank you. Is
Oh yeah, totally.
there anything else you want to add?
Um, I mean, I guess I've probably already said it, but it just comes, really down to what they're interested in and then turn that into the learning experience. Like with my daughter, she loves watermelon, but she also likes getting toys at the store. So I'm going to take her up to the feed store. I'm going to give her money. She's going to buy the watermelon seeds. So, she'll learn how to communicate with people and learn math. And then we're going to plant them. And then she's going to water them. And she'll learn about responsibility and having to take care of stuff. And then we're going to harvest them. And she wants to sell them. Of course, she'll eat some too. But this whole process is kind of life and business. And that's what you need to survive. And she's really artistic and she likes to do that stuff. So I think that can be turned into, this is play and it's fun, but you're also going to learn how to turn this into business and be able to survive and sustain yourself and reach your goals. And I think everyone has that, and it can be pretty easy to follow it, but you just got to kind of leave the other mindset behind of curriculum and test and, sit down and learn this.
Yeah. Unless they're really interested in it, because sometimes my daughter just pulls out the book.
Yeah.
She wants to practice it, and that's really what it's. The stuff is always there. It's not necessarily
Right.
I'm going to do this right now. I'm going to time you. No, that's institutional to me. Yeah.
Definitely. And if they want to do it, they're going to do it really well. And that
Mhm.
can be applied to real life skills as well.
Mhm.
So it's one of those things where once they're able to kind of direct their own education, I think it can be a lot easier for everyone and more successful.
Mhm. Well, a few of us are getting together tomorrow afternoon at 3. I think I mentioned to you a couple weeks ago, so you'd have it in your calendar. Hopefully
Yeah.
you can jump in and contribute to some of these things that you've said to me today. It's just a roundtable discussion, so it'll be probably questions that other people have that haven't started anything into it. And it's maybe it's also some of their experiences of being schooled and trying to understand what it would be like as someone like yourself who have already gone through it, not being schooled. And so, yeah, that's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So if you want
Cool.
to join in,
Yeah.
we'll
Well,
just pick a boardroom and jump in there.
that sounds good. I did actually think of one other thing. Um, I know a lot of parents I guess they feel judged if their kids don't know a certain thing by a certain time. I have some family members that act like that, pretty extreme. I remember being a kid and someone would ask me, like, I think I was 8, and I couldn't read very well. And then it kind of turns into oh, you can't read and we can read, what's wrong with you? And then, some parents might feel bad as well, thinking their kid's falling behind.
Yeah.
But I think when you let go of that, it's really freeing. Like, Ashlyn can't write her name very well, but she can unload the dishwasher 100% by herself. And she's been doing that since she was 4, or she
Mhm.
makes a sandwich. So, I mean, what's more important, to learn how to effectively write your name right now, or to actually take care of yourself? Whereas most people today probably can't take care of themselves very well. They learned how to write their name when they were 4, but now they can't take care of themselves. And I
Mhm.
think not falling for that stress and that societal approval of learning a certain thing by a certain age is pretty freeing. I think it's going to be more beneficial for the child as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. My mother-in-law is a school teacher, retired school teacher. So she does come and she'll kind of sit down and kind of see where they're at. And you can see like she has judgment.
Yeah.
My brother-in-law is a pharmacist, and finding out about me and my home birth experiences out as well. So I'll just be the black sheep in the family, I guess.
Yeah.
And it can be sad though, because I think that there are some problems that they are having with their own children, and it's too bad that they don't see
Right.
differences. It's right there. You can see a lot of the challenges, and some of my niece and nephews are autistic, and it's unfortunate that they're going to have some limitations, but it's never brought up that anything that I'm doing is anything that's correlated to the healthier kind of side of how their development has been. So yeah, it's interesting. Those influences, like I can speak to it because it's so easy to get caught up in even day-to-day other homeschooling groups.
Right.
I have a hard time hanging out with even homeschooling groups because it's the same thing. It's where you're at, what curriculum you're using. Oh, now you're in this box, or I think that there's such a misperception of what unschooling is as well, or passion-led or interest-led. There's all these different names for everything, and really what it comes down to is just, it should be just the child and the parents' relationship and their journey, or whatever that looks like, because every child's going to be different.
Well, that's exactly it. And that's the problem with the curriculum and the metrics of, your kid needs to be here by a certain age.
Yeah.
Like, that's comparing all kids as being the same, and they should all be individuals.
Yeah. I think that, like, even with the trivia method, you can get locked into that as well. Like at 12, they're supposed to be into logic and doing all of these other things, and it can get really, systematized, and rather than just organic in this non-linear fashion.
Yeah, and it can be negative the other way too, where you don't teach them something before a certain age because the curriculum says they're not ready for it. Whereas I've talked with Ashlyn, my daughter. I guess she was about 4 at the time. We started talking about philosophy and the identification of things, and she really liked it, and she was good at it. She's like, "Oh, I want to learn more." The same thing with anatomy. But if you stick with the curriculum and some sort of linear learning, it's like, at this age, this is when we have to teach them that.
Right.
And it might actually be holding them back as well.
Yes, definitely. I found that was my experience with the Waldorf philosophies. It was put me in a dogma that really was not healthy for my relationship with my children, as well as where my children were at, and did hold them back a bit because I thought, oh no, that's not age appropriate, because they were so strict on that. And yet it's just that sense of curiosity. Now you're just kind of giving the wrong message. I was giving the wrong message of, oh, I can't learn this.
Right.
Or, that's stopping that curiosity when it could be really an opportunity, learning opportunity. Yeah. Well, this is great. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure that this will be a great resource for other people in the course.
Well, great. Yeah, thanks for setting this up. I appreciate it. It was good talking with you.
Good talking with you. Thanks so much, Jordan.
I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, bye.